Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Joseph. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. You are ready and welcome. You are
Thanks.
the early bird.
I just wanted to make sure it was all working.
Yeah. It's all working, and then we have people as well waiting in the meeting room.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we'll admit them as they're coming in. I'm admitting Paul. Japheth, welcome.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm good. I was testing it. It's always good to enter a few minutes early to see whether everything is working well.
Yeah, we are all well. Things are working well.
Have you started looking at the report I sent you?
Yeah, Arnold, he's going to join.
Hi, Japheth. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Can't complain, thanks.
How is Joburg?
Freezing.
Nairobi also.
And are you in Pretoria at the moment?
Pardon?
Are you in Pretoria at the moment?
No, I'm in Nairobi.
All right. Okay. How's Nairobi?
It's cold, but not freezing.
Just switch this off.
Joseph, hi.
Welcome.
Why now?
Doing well.
Is Joseph frozen?
No, I'm not. I'm not.
Oh, you're
Can you
not.
hear
Okay.
me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Good. How are you?
Okay, I'm trying to admit. I see Shigaya is already here.
Yeah.
So we are missing. We are missing one person.
Who is that we're missing?
We have Japheth, Lisa, Shireya around.
Zaria.
Zahara, I think she's trying to join. She's trying to join.
Okay, so we said our order is Shreya, Lisa, Zahara, and Japheth, or did we agree on that order?
That was agreed upon.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Shireya, and welcome.
Hi, I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, and then Joseph, actually,
Yeah.
you didn't give me the brief bios, did you?
Okay, let me share with you. Christina is online. She can share that quickly with you.
Okay, perfect. We already have 17 participants. To those who are joining us, this webinar will be starting in a few minutes. We're just dealing with housekeeping issues. But the way it's going to happen is that you see that at the bottom of the screen, there is a space where if anyone feels that you want to send a chat message about the conversation that is going to be happening, ask questions, you can put them in that chat box. You will also be able to raise your hands if you've got questions that you want to ask about anything that is being discussed by our panelists, Joseph Bikanda and Christine from Pan-Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, Africa Defenders, will be helping me, Arnold Sunga, who is going to be moderating, to make sure that all questions that are asked are put to the panelists. So just bear with us for a few more minutes as we just finalize our preparation and begin the webinar. If you are joining us now, we will be starting in about 3 to 4 minutes. We're just waiting for 1 or 2 key participants.
Hello, Zaga, and welcome.
Good afternoon to you all. I'm now told that all the panelists who are supposed to be with us are here. My name is Arnold Tsunga. I work with the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network for purpose of my presentation here. This is a webinar that is being organized by the African Defenders, which is generally known also as the Pan-Africa Human Rights Defenders Network. And it's a very useful program that we are going to be having around the question of strengthening the collaboration between academic institutions and civil society in Africa, especially around the concept of protecting civic space as well as protecting human rights defenders. You know that Pan-Africa Human Rights Defenders is a leading institutions that coordinates the work of different sub-regional human rights defenders network in order to ensure that there is a coordinated approach to protection of human rights defenders as well as civic space. All of us know that human rights defenders are extremely important in terms of documenting violations of human rights, speaking to power, ensuring that the rights of ordinary people who are usually vulnerable and are at the mercy sometimes of those who violate the rights of others. You need human rights defenders to be able to stand up and speak to power. And usually as a result of that, they then face persecution and retribution. We also know that civic space is so important for people to be effectively involved in matters that affect them in the civic affairs, in the political affairs of the nation, to be able to demand for accountable governance, as well as to be able to redefine solutions to matters that affect them. And we also know that when you have an active civil society, an active human rights defenders community, and an open civic space, there are better chances that our societies will develop. But at the same time, when you have deficits in democracy, when you have unaccountable governance and governments, and when you have people with authoritarian and dictatorial tendencies, usually then societies do not develop. And at the same time, those environments are really dangerous for human rights defenders. We also know that we have had our academic institutions in Africa as spaces where there's been exercise of academic freedom, where people have used that as the engine room for brainstorming, for personal development, for interrogating and research on issues that affect society in order for societies to keep moving forward and to develop. So academic freedom is absolutely important, and our universities epitomize the centers and institutions where this is exercised. And we have also seen that sometimes when human rights defenders are facing persecution, they may actually be real opportunities for them to further their studies, to be at universities, to exchange their views, to be able to enrich communities where they can feel safe and be able to continue practicing their human rights defending. So I think what the Secretariat at African Defenders, Christine and Joseph, have done for us is to create this deliberate brainstorming opportunity where we can look at how to strengthen the collaboration between academic institutions and civic society around the shrinking of civic space. Some people say civic space is shrinking in some spaces, but is expanding in others. Others say that civic space is shifting rather than shrinking, and that you have to be able to see the movement and shifts to be able to remain relevant. So I think these are some of the things that colleagues are going to be talking about. So collaboration between academic institutions, civil society organizations, human rights defenders, can produce mutual benefits. For example, universities can provide safe sanctuaries, neutral space for exchange, where human rights defenders can further their work while academic institutions collaborating with the human rights defenders can become closer to the communities and be able to provide thought leadership to resolve things that are relevant for communities. And I must end by saying that the African Defenders with its sub-regional groups have conceived of a program that has been run and coordinated very well by Christine called the Ubuntu Hub Cities project, where essentially we are using the phenomenon and deep-rooted cultural characteristic of Africans of what we call humanism, the human in us, to be able to be the basis on which, when human rights defenders are facing pressure, persecution for standing up for the rights of others, they are then received in foreign lands, in faraway societies from their communities, and looked after on the basis of our common destiny and common humanity. And this program of Ubuntu, one of the things that it has done is to look at service provision that is necessary to sustain a human rights defender who may unfortunately face the possibility of being shifted away from their usual place of operation as a result of being targeted. So universities are increasingly becoming the institutions of choice. One, it allows for the human rights defender to be in an environment where they can continue with their work. It also gives them an opportunity to develop in their area of application, area of interest, and to become better human rights defenders. And then it also allows for enriching of culture, because universities usually are centers that are cosmopolitan in nature, where there's a mixture and mingling of people of different cultures and diverse background. So I think this conversation fits very well within that idea of consciously developing that relationship between universities and human rights defenders, especially around the auspices of the Ubuntu Hub Cities concept. And we have a very good panel that is going to lead us in a conversation. And this panel, I'm going to give each one of them between 5 and 10 minutes to do their preliminary introductory remarks around the concepts that I've just explained. And then we'll then get into a situation where there can be questions from the audience. And then we can get into a second round and possibly third round, depending on how quickly we are able to resolve issues. So we do have Shreya Balhara, who is at Scholars at Risk, which is one of the well-established programs for protection services of human rights defenders and intellectuals who may be facing persecution as a result of their work. She works with at-risk scholars and universities within the Scholars at Risk network to arrange temporary university positions for scholars as well as practitioners. And she's been piloting a new program that I think she's going to share with us. We also have Lisa Chamberlain, who is with the Wits University in South Africa. She's a social justice activist and attorney and senior lecturer at the School of Law in South Africa at the University of Wits. She's also a research associate at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, also with the University of Wits. And she has also previously worked with the Center for Applied Legal Studies as a deputy director. Then we do have Dr. Zahara Nampeo from Makerere University. She's a lawyer and an academic and a human rights practitioner. And she's with the School of Law and heads the Human Rights and Peace Center and Research and Advocacy Center at the Makerere University, and already has a lot of experience in terms of collaboration between the university and civil society. Then We do have my brother Jafet, Dr. Jafet Biegon, who works as the Africa Regional Advocacy Coordinator for Amnesty International, leading and coordinating the organization's advocacy initiatives and engagement with the African Union policy and human rights bodies. He's also an adjunct professor at the Center for Human Rights Faculty of Law, University of Pretoria, and is extensively written on the African human rights system and practically analyzing how it has been effective in protecting the rights in Africa. So I think we are spoiled for listening, if I can say it that way. Then what I said earlier on, before giving the speakers an opportunity to speak, is that if you have any questions, there is a chat box at the bottom. You can put your questions, and we really encourage you to have ongoing chatting as the speakers are speaking to enrich the conversation. You can also raise your hand by clicking, if you click the participants tab, it will give you an opportunity where you can then press to raise your hand, and then we'll be able to pick you, and we can give you an opportunity to ask your questions. So please feel free, and this is really open and safe space for human rights defenders. So I'm going to start with Shreya to give us her initial talk. You know, Shreya, with I think Scholars at Risk and the wide experience that you guys have had in rolling out a program for the protection of defenders and for protection of intellectuals who face pressure. Are you able to give us a bit of a sense of the protection that comes, the role of human rights defenders, the role of a university in protection human rights defending, as well as in offering protection whilst at the same time guaranteeing the right to academic freedom? Over to you, Shreya.
Thank you so much, Arnold. I'd be happy to, as Arnold shared, hello everyone, my name is Shreya Bolhara, and I'm a program officer at Scholars at Risk, or SAR for short. I want to thank African Defenders for holding this event and providing space to learn about how organizations and universities can work together to strengthen civil society, address issues of academic freedom violations, and protect at-risk individuals, including human rights defenders. SAR, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, is an international network of higher education institutions whose collective mission is to protect scholars and promote academic freedom. SAR presents a practical, collective way to meet the urgent needs of scholars, students, universities, and civil society communities under threat. We meet this mission through our three core program areas: protection services, advocacy, and research and learning. The first, which is protection, which Arnold alluded to, is where I work. I work on the protection services team, reviewing applications from individuals that are reporting threats to their academic freedom and managing communication closely with primary representatives and individuals for SAR at member universities to arrange positions of temporary academic refuge for at-risk scholars. While our work in arranging these positions focuses on scholars and academic researchers, it has always included a wide range of other individuals targeted for their ideas, including journalists, artists, democracy and human rights advocates, lawyers, writers, or as we're referring to them, practitioners at risk. I'm developing a pilot program at SAR of the same name called Practitioners at Risk to explore university support for these individuals, including through temporary positions on university campuses that relate to study, research, teaching, etc. SAR is also coordinating an affinity group to guide discussion and grow interest in this work, and invites participations from universities, colleges, organizations that are interested in growing these conversations on campus. Pivoting a little bit to how SAR works on academic freedom, our advocacy work furthers our work directly assisting scholars and practitioners by monitoring and addressing violations of academic freedom. We advocate on behalf of imprisoned scholars and issue monitoring reports on attacks on the academic freedom of students, scholars, universities and higher education communities. In our 2019 Free to Think report, which is published annually, the next one will be coming up in November of this year, we analyzed 324 attacks on higher education communities, including instances of killings, imprisonment, prosecution, loss of position, etc. And over 50 of these were in the African continent. For a further breakdown of these, and I'm happy to share the report in the chat, I can link to the report if people are interested in taking a deeper dive into that. But our commitment to address violations of academic freedom expands into our research and learning work, which are our third area of work at SAR. This work provides frameworks and tools for university staff, including administrators and faculty, students and higher education communities, to aptly address situations which can cause violations of academic freedom to arise. In this way, SAR hopes to not only address in a sort of retroactive manner the risks already facing scholars by responding to providing positions for them and providing assistance for them, but also to monitor academic freedom attacks so we have a better understanding of what that landscape looks like and how we can do advocacy to try and lessen these attacks on a national, regional, and international scale, but then also looking further to trying to address the root causes for why these issues might arise on university campuses. So as you can see, the issue of attacks on higher education communities and the promotion of academic freedom are too large for one university to tackle alone. So a collective response is needed. The work of the SAR network is more essential now than ever, and we invite your institution to join the network and to engage at all levels, including through, for example, hosting lectures, talks, etc., featuring at-risk SAR scholars and on topics of academic freedom, advocating on behalf of an imprisoned scholar on campus, either through some publicized high-level campaigning or through as we call them, student advocacy seminars, where students can get involved through their coursework on campaigning on behalf of an imprisoned scholar, hosting an at-risk scholar or practitioner through a temporary position. And the list goes on in terms of ways to get involved. But most of all, participating in activities to protect the freedom of everyone to think, question, and share ideas in an effort to preserve and strengthen civil society. So I know I shared a lot, and I'm happy to provide more clarity when we get to the Q&A section if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more, but I wanted to give an overview of what we do, how it relates to academic freedom, and how there's opportunities for collaboration for universities in the African continent to get involved to further this work. So thank you so much, and Arnold, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shreya. And I think the challenge that you're giving to universities in Africa to be part of the network that can benefit from your years of experience in terms of offering safe spaces for academics who may find themselves at risk and therefore needing to have their protection, one, but also to have advocacy around their issues whilst they continue being involved in their work. I think it's a very valuable piece of information that you've given, and we will be able to take that forward, especially as we continue trying to tweak on the Ubuntu Hubs program and the typology of services that may be needed to accommodate the range of human rights defenders who find themselves being forced to sort of leave their places of normal residence to get temporary security. So we will move to Lisa and we'll get here to hear a bit about the South African experience and the opportunities for synergy of action between civil society and universities at the national and regional level. And, you know, whether South Africa is involved in this consciously or not, I think it's a reality that universities in South Africa have become a huge destination for a lot of scholars, a lot of human rights defenders from within the region and outside of the region of Southern Africa who want to pursue further studies, but at the same time, we also feel that maybe if they are burning out, they need to do a bit more reading if they want to deepen their knowledge about an area of interest and passion. They go to South African universities, but at the same time, ourselves as human rights defenders, we've also already started having active approaches to universities to take some of the defenders who have the right qualification and capacity to do short-term studies whilst they're managing the security situation that they'll be going through within the region. So Lisa, over to you, and just to get a sense of what is possible.
Hi everyone, and thanks Arnold. I'm really chuffed to be able to have the opportunity to engage on all of these really important issues with many of you who have a lot of experience in this area. In my initial remarks, I'd like to focus on some of the ways in which we can collaborate. But before then, just a few comments on why universities and civil society are really very natural allies. Arnold's referred to many of the ways in which the work of each can strengthen the other. In that input from civil society ensures that academic teaching and research is relevant and realistic, rather than just being about a bunch of dusty academics passing judgment on the world from some kind of ivory tower, which had often been their approach in the past. Whereas engaging with those directly involved in different struggles really brings a richness and a texture to learning that goes far beyond what a formal lecture and classroom experience can offer. And on the other side of the coin, academic research carries a lot of weight, which can help to give activist campaigns enhanced credibility. And so the authority that universities carry can often be usefully deployed in defense of HRDs. In addition, universities are often spaces that incubate and that train future civil society leaders and that help to kind of create a space to refresh the thinking of those in the field who need a bit of a timeout. And lastly, and importantly, I think both activism and academia are spaces which foster debate, which generate creative ideas, and which are really all about envisaging how the world should be, rather than just focusing on how it is. So how then do we harness this potential for collaboration? I've only got a few minutes now, so I'll just throw out 5 ideas and we can take those up further in discussion.
Lisa, I see that Joseph is pushing your PowerPoint. Is he moving at the same speed with you? You can tell him to move to the next slide if you feel the audience will follow better.
Sure. You're welcome to share it. I only included it because there's some links kind of later which might be of use to people.
Okay.
But you can move, Joseph. I'll be on the 3rd slide, and you can just leave it on the 3rd slide. Okay. So the first opportunity for collaboration is really about the role that university centers can play. And university centers are organizations that are based in a university but often operate a lot like an NGO. The Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits, CALS, where I worked for many years, is a good example of this. And CALS operates as a public interest law clinic representing communities in court and also providing them with a range of other kinds of support. And I know that coming up, we're also lucky enough to have Zahara here from the Human Rights and Peace Center, which I think plays a very similar kind of role at Makerere. And centers like this, by design, have one foot in the world of civil society and the other in academia, which can have a range of benefits. Centers like this can often bring people around a table who wouldn't usually find themselves in the same space. And at CALS, we found that one of the interesting benefits from resulting from our university placement was that we were able to access information much more easily than our colleagues in civil society. Typically, both government and the private sector are a lot less defensive when they receive an access to information request from a university researcher rather than from an activist or a lawyer. And so we could put that hat on and get hold of quite a lot of useful documents, which of course we'd then pass on to colleagues in civil society. The second idea is that of commissioned research. Academics are always looking for ways for their work to be more relevant, and many are interested in working on the same issues around human rights in general and the closing of civic space in particular, or as Arnold challenges us to think about it, shifts in civic space. So individual academics and particularly scholars at university centers can be asked to conduct a piece of research that's needed by civil society. And what's helpful in that context is that academics often can tap into funding sources for research that activists just don't have access to. A third form of collaboration is university interventions in court cases, obviously often as amicus curiae or friends of the court. And I'd like to offer a current case from South Africa as a quick example of this. In this case, which is ongoing at the moment, a large mining company has sued 2 public interest lawyers and a community activist for defamation. The case interestingly came about because the lawyers and the activist were invited to present at a summer school on mining run by the University of Cape Town, which was a course specifically designed to allow environmental activists and academics to work together to create a new model of adult education by building on links with civil society struggles and seeking to ground research in strong academic civil society networks. So it's an example of precisely the kind of collaboration that we're talking about and trying to foster here. Interestingly, what happened was that in their presentation, the presenters said some things that the mining company didn't like, such as the company was operating illegally, which they were, and so the company sued them. The case is a clear example of a SLAP suit. SLAP, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. SLAP suits are essentially about the use of court cases to try and intimidate activists to shutting up. And so typically what happens is that a large corporation will sue an activist for defamation, which is called libel in some countries, claiming huge amounts of money, even though the company knows full well that the claim has no merit. In this particular case, both CALS and the University of Cape Town have intervened in the case in support of the activists. CALS to present findings of a research project into activist victimization experiences in order to show that SLAP suits are located in a broader picture of threats to HRDs. And the University of Cape Town is arguing that what was said at the summer school is covered by academic freedom, suggesting a line of protection for human rights defenders who may be able to speak out with greater protection if they do it in academic spaces where their contribution is covered by the protection of the academic project more broadly. So it's an interesting example to just remind us that activists' inclusion in academic spaces is not without risk. There is a role for academic institutions to play. Both of these interventions in this court case are designed to assist the court in understanding what the case really is and what it's about, and also to help balance out the power dynamic, the inequality in power, which is often present between large corporations and activists in litigation. The fourth idea is that of university-based fellowships for activists, and I think it's one that's acutely relevant to the kind of larger framing of human rights defender relocation programs. One example of this in our context is a fellowship that's hosted by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. And this fellowship program really gives experienced civil society activists the opportunity to take time out from the important but exhausting work that they do, to develop their networks with a particular focus on the Global South, and to conduct a piece of research while they're there. And in turn, the fellows help the center to better understand and address issues of inequality in the Global South, and particularly to make links between theory and practice. It's a 6-month funded fellowship, after which the fellows return to the front lines of activist work. There are currently 4 fellows on this particular program, a feminist civil society leader, a water and environmental justice activist, a leading trade unionist, and a public interest lawyer. If any of you are interested in the program, funding dependent, there should be another round of applications next year in about March or April. So the best thing to do is to sign up to the center's newsletter or to follow them on Twitter. I have included the links for all of that and the handles in the PowerPoint presentation. And then just a last practical suggestion for strengthening the ties between academia and civil society, which is that international bodies, both at the UN level and regionally on the continent, often look to universities as the pool from which they appoint people like special rapporteurs. This is because these kinds of positions are typically unpaid and require both extensive flexibility in working hours and the ability to travel, and academics are amongst the few groups of people for whom all of that is possible. But what this does is present civil society with a real opportunity to make nominations for vacant positions as they arise from amongst academics who have proven themselves as allies. So really, in summary, there are a lot of good reasons why universities and civil society should collaborate. And most importantly, that collaboration strengthens the work of both and isn't just one way. I've suggested 5 concrete forms that collaboration can take: leveraging the unique placement of university centers; 2, commissioning research; 3, drawing universities into court cases; 4, university-based fellowships for activists; and lastly, nominating international rapporteurs from amongst academic allies. These ideas are not necessarily focused on human rights defender protection directly, but rather on how the work of universities and civil society can be mutually reinforcing. They speak to how to establish relationships of trust between academics and activists, which critically would then make it possible to draw on the support and the resources of a university at a later stage in order to protect an individual human rights defender when a specific threat arose. So I'm sure there's many, many more ways in which we can foster collaboration, but I'll leave it there and hopefully we can explore more in discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. So I didn't mute it. Thank you very much for a very good presentation indeed about the possibilities for collaboration between universities and civil society, and at the same time the question of how that collaboration can also create space for better protection of human rights defenders in appropriate situations. So I liked your very broad. You covered quite broadly the areas where there can be possibilities of cooperation, but also the advantages for civil society and for universities, because at the end of it all, you ended up saying that there's a mutual interest or mutual reinforcing of interests when there is that collaboration. So with civil society, human rights defenders, I think the issue of the academic weight of being associated as an alumni of a university increases the profile. And usually we've seen in our sector that once the defender gets more profile, it's more difficult to be targeted and to be attacked and persecuted, because the costs of attacking is usually, the political costs is higher when a person has got a higher profile. Then the question of credibility, the reputation, the issue of incubating ideas, and then the honing of leadership that is necessary, because I think without proper leadership and a deepening of knowledge in the area where human rights defenders work, sometimes that translates into a vulnerability, because with advocacy on sensitive matters where sometimes you've not done enough research and enough evidence base, it can be easy for those outputs that are being used as the advocacy outputs to be dismissed on inaccuracies and on unreliability and maybe not being too dependable. So I think it's very important, the things that you have raised. And then the question that whilst for civil society, it can give an opportunity for rest and respite. For human rights defenders, it can give an opportunity for, improving yourself whilst a risk is passing. And then at the same time, because of the ability of universities to get resources to support research, to support short-term courses, that may also actually quite help and come timely for defenders as well as for civil society who may be needing that. So I think it's been an incredibly useful presentation about what South Africa can offer to defenders, and we will obviously think about it in the context of our Ubuntu Hub City concept that is still a developing concept, even if we've already started sort of implementing the relocation of defenders. We're going to hear from Zahara, who is with the University of Makerere. In this part of the world, Southern Africa, where we come from, when someone from East Africa says, I'm from the University of, I passed through the University of Makerere, there's almost a presumption that the person received a very good education, and it has got an excellent reputation in terms of it being an area where cosmopolitan in nature, where people from different countries went to Makerere to learn, to be able to cross-pollinate culture and ideas, but at the same time to live in an environment where there can be relative safety. So Zahara, the opportunities for collaboration between civil society and the university, I know that you'll be able to give us some concrete pieces of how that collaboration can look like. Over to you, Zahara.
Okay, thank you very much, Arnold, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for that compliment on behalf of Makerere University, which is soon making 100 years. And I do accept it and agree. We actually just recently lost our alumnus, the former president of Tanzania, which really speaks to how well we've done in the region, at least in the previous past. So thank you for that compliment. Once again, I'm Zahara Nampeo from School of Law, Makerere University. I'm also the director for the Human Rights and Peace Center. The Human Rights and Peace Center is a unit, a center of the School of Law at Makerere University. It is the research and advocacy, and I would also call it the activist arm of the School of Law that has taken a lead in some of the aspects that may not sit quite comfortably with the School of Law as an administrative unit of the university. So mostly we do research and advocacy on pertinent human rights and governance issues in the region. And we have taken a lead in some of the issues that have been fairly contentious. We've raised our voice against violations of academic freedom. We've also joined in strategic litigation against some of the matters that are considered fairly political. So I think as the Human Rights and Peace Center in the lead at the School of Law, we've done quite a bit of work in the area of governance. So coming after Lisa has made my work fairly easy, seeing that she is also in a university setting. And what I'm going to do really is to perhaps elaborate and a little bit more about our own context in Uganda and give some specific examples of collaboration and support. But I would like to start by emphasizing, and something that Lisa already mentioned, the advantages of working with the university setting, which we already understand and the gist of this webinar today. But I'd like to start by saying that universities are not really bound by some of the newer legislation that we are seeing these days that is fairly restrictive to civic space. In the case of Uganda, we have the NGO legislation that is fairly restrictive with regard to registration requirements and the like. The Public Order and Management Act, which requires seeking of permission from the police. Of course, that has been recently outlawed by the Constitutional Court, but which had the effect of, silencing and slowing the work of civil society and larger groups generally. I'd also like to say that universities are fairly advantageous places or forum, because not only of the researchers that we have, the members of the faculty, but also the students. I think that is a big resource when we are talking about work, human rights defense work. Many times when we are doing human rights defense work, we want issues to be picked up and for the public to take an interest in them. In Kampala these days, if there's going to be an uprising or a reaction on a critical governance or other matter, the first thing that the government does is to close off the university and ensure that the students do not cross, to the city, because they know that the passionate, the eager young people are, a weight that can actually add value to some of the causes that are led by civil society. But in terms of emphasizing what has already been said, I think universities have the potential to support civil society and human rights defense work generally through the research that we undertake, the deep empirical data, which can be used to influence advocacy even on what I would perceive as difficult issues. And I'll give an example. Right now at the School of Law, we are doing an intensive study on securitization of development in the country right now. A specific example is the way that we see a more visible role of security forces in the fishing sector. The fact that the government army now is in charge of overseeing the fishing, which has actually interfered with the livelihoods of the poor fisher folk. This kind of study requires a critical analysis of the law, and whereas the law allows, for example, fisher folk to fish different species of fish, some for consumption, others for commercial use, right now the way that the law is being enforced is to emphasize certain species of fish, and unfortunately, these are mostly for export. So it has taken our study and our engagement to bring out some of these issues. And as Lisa mentioned, a research that's coming from a university is may be taken differently. But then the other role that we see that we have played in this kind of study is linking the local community-based organizations with the larger civil society organizations at the national level. So I believe that research is really important, especially if it's mixing the academic angle to a practitioner experience. We are also doing a special issue of our journal on freedom of expression, freedom of information, freedom of association in this time of COVID. Focusing on Uganda and Tanzania, we've had cases of restrictions on these particular rights, especially as the government is enforcing the COVID measures. So with support from the American Bar Association, we are having this special issue, and we allowed not only academics to share their pieces here, but also media person and other human rights defenders coming in. So I think we through our research and we allow collaboration in a way that is advantageous to both civil society as well as the academia. I also would like to say that we as academia have a role to play, and there's a collaboration, a potential collaboration to support civil society organizations in living up to the standards that they should ideally have. Many times civil society organizations are calling upon duty bearers to do this and the other, but we ourselves in civil society are not accountable. So with the support of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, and I'm happy that Irene Petra is here with us, we received support from this center to develop a curriculum on civil society law, which we have infused in 2 courses at the School of Law. And this course focuses on rights such as freedom of speech and assembly and association, but also emphasizes aspects such as corporate and civil society governance and accountability. How do you manage? How do you account to your beneficiaries? How do you account to your staff? Which are things that sometimes we overlook as civil society, and yet which are very important. I'd also like to mention that we have played a role, and I think there is a big collaboration for civil society and academia in terms of legal reform and advocacy. The Human Rights and Peace Center is a member of the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Governance in Uganda. And this coalition brings together over 10 civil society organizations. And we filed a case that actually challenged the passing of the AHA. The AHA is the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which had fairly stringent measures against persons of a different sexual orientation, proposing even a death sentence at the time when before the act had been passed to life imprisonment. So we were critical in this petition by providing research, by backing up the petition through research. We also, in 2016, filed an amicus curiae brief in the 2016 presidential election petition. This was a petition that was brought by one of the presidential candidates, the one who was not successful. And for the first time, we brought out the issue of the use of an amicus curiae, and we were joined by other civil society organizations, Foundation for Human Rights Initiative. I see Dr. Livingston Sewanyana is here, but we set the pace and we were the pioneer for this. And I think that is a potential collaboration. But more recently, on 13th of July this year, we filed a case in the Constitutional Court challenging the Land Act for its discriminatory and unequal treatment of tenants and landowners. And the hope is that these particular provisions of the Land Act will be nullified and revisions made. Unfortunately, because we are part of a public university, we cannot bring the petition as the Human Rights and Peace Center. We are not a legal person. The case is being made in my own names, but the potential here is that we work collaboratively with other organizations, especially where you need further research and financial support to take the case further. So I see that there is a big potential for civil society organizations to work together with academic institutions for the capacity to generate and utilize knowledge, and of course the civil society simplifying and also widely disseminating this. A lot of the knowledge that we generate sometimes stays in the journals, and we need for this to be broken down and it reaching different audiences. So I think it's important that civil society and academia come together, put joint forces, and be able to work on collaborative projects. In terms of other possible areas of collaboration, I think there's a possibility for us to host human rights defenders who need some time away, but with support of tuition and scholarships from civil society organizations. So that fundraising angle would be important, coming from institutions such as the one that Shreya represents. So I believe that there's definitely space for us to run mutually beneficial projects, especially projects that would otherwise not get funding through the university or through government, but through other sources. I can say more a little bit later, but I think I'll put it to a stop here, having highlighted some of those examples from Uganda. Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zahara Nampeo, and you have articulated very well the opportunities that exist in terms of cooperation potentially between civil society and universities. And I think the question of filing of amicus in appropriate cases where expertise may be needed, but also to give our judiciary and institutions of arbitration of disputes a real opportunity to have issues properly canvassed and the law explained. I think that is very good. I was also quite happy that you also brought about the question of accountability to civil society as well, rather than just to be looking at saying we are holier than thou, and that it's only governments that have failures and problems around the question of accountability. So I think speaking from the issue of that one of the big drivers of threats becoming a reality for civil society and human rights defenders is the question of vulnerabilities. And that if a civil society actor or civil society organization or a human rights defender has got very high vulnerabilities, they are likely to succumb to threats that they face. So if you then work towards a systematic reduction of vulnerabilities and increasing capacities that help them to withstand the pressure arising from the risks that they face, you are likely to see that you can do both prevention of the threats from becoming reality, but also you could also do mitigation that would help for defenders if the threat becomes a reality, to have some mitigation that reduces the impact of the attack on defenders. So I think your combination of work with the International Center for Non-Profit Law, which Irene Petras, as you rightfully identified, has been working to develop, and for which we have total appreciation at the Pan-Africa Human Rights Defenders, because it's very important work that the ICNL has been doing. I think it's important because it deliberately works to strengthen the capacity of civil society, of NGOs, to understand their operating terrain, to understand the laws, to define their own systems and policies to be able to avoid falling victim as a result of the application of the laws on themselves. So I think that course that the Makerere University is going to be giving to civil society with the support of ICNL is extremely important. But now that you started the question of mentioning people who are in this meeting, I also then looked at the participants list, and indeed I saw Irene Petras, who I acknowledge. I also saw Dr. Livingston Sewanyana, who is the United Nations independent expert on democratic and equitable international order. So I really wish to welcome Dr. Livingston and to say it's good that the Pan-Africa Human Rights Defenders has connected us. I also know that Paul Grady is here. I know that his name has gone ahead of his person in terms of the question of civil society getting opportunities to collaborate with universities and getting protection. And at the University of York, I've really enjoyed reading the research that they've done in terms of the efficacy of the protection mechanisms and their impact on defenders. It's something that I've used personally here in Southern Africa. And so it's very good to see you around. This takes us to Dr. Japhet. And Japhet, you know, you've worked a lot with the African system. You have also worked a lot with the university. And I think you're one of those academics who qualifies to be called pracademics. Pracademic meaning that you have a strong academic sense, but also you have a very strong practical application presence on the African human rights system. And so you may want to share with us the collaboration that universities can have with CSOs in protecting human rights, and in particular, the nexus that would allow them to engage with the African human rights system. Over to you, Dr. Bijon.
Thanks, Arnold, and thanks to Defenders for this opportunity. As Arnold says, I would like to focus my presentation on human rights defenders, activists, and in the African human rights space, the institutions and organs established by the African Union to promote and protect human rights. And I want to focus on 4 particular issues. One is the relevance of the collaboration between academics, universities, and civil societies can bring in bridging the gap that I call the silos in the human rights movement and space in Africa. And then second, the role that universities and academics can play in public interest litigation, especially at the regional level. Nampeo has already spoken about litigation at the domestic level, so I want to focus a little bit at the regional level. And then I'll speak briefly about the role of the Center for Human Rights in developing and delivering courses that could be relevant to human rights defenders. And then finally, the role of Amnesty International in providing relief in certain cases to academics and human rights defenders on the continent. On the question of bridging the different silos, the different thematic and components of civil society in Africa. One of the enduring features of the human rights movement, and especially the civil society movement in Africa, is that we work more often than not, for perhaps reasons beyond our control, in silos. And by this I mean that we have organizations that work on mainstream human rights issues, others that work on peace and security issues, others that work on humanitarian issues, and others that work on specific groups of individuals or people that require specific human rights promotion and protection. And while in theory, the nexus between these issues, the humanitarian issues, the peace and security issues, the human rights issues, are recognized by civil society and academics, many of these civil society groups work in silos. There is little collaboration and coordination and synergies between these groups, such that you'll find that, for instance, organizations that work with the African Commission, they are Banjul focused and only work with the Banjul Commission. The same applies to organizations that focus on democracy and election issues. Their predominant focus and spotlight is on Midrand, on the Pan-African Parliament. And others focus on Arusha, and peace and security institutions and humanitarian institutions focus in Addis Ababa, where the Peace and Security Council and other relevant organs are based. Therefore, we could, in this sense, say we have Banjul focused, Addis Ababa focused, Midrand focused, Arusha focused CSOs. And I think we need now to move from theory to practice. And I think the universities and academics could come here by creating platforms that could bring all these actors together. It is understandable that we as CSOs have little resources to engage all these bodies. We have narrow mandates, which is understandable and meaningful for optimum impact. And also our interactions, our engagements with the African human rights system are projects, move in project cycles. But we need individuals like academics and universities who can move back and look at the system as a whole, and then create the platform that all these actors from the different parts of the system can come together and deploy and leverage their strengths to ensure that all the components of the African human rights systems are utilized and all parts work together in a more synergized, in a more seamless manner. I think that's one area where the role of academics, the role of universities, and I'll speak how, for instance, the University of Pretoria has helped to do that. The second area is that universities, professors, academics have long wished, for instance, to be engaged as amicus curiae or filing amicus briefs before the regional bodies. But as we know, at the African Commission, at the Children's Committee, the communications procedures, although the 99.9% of communications are filed there by CSOs, those processes are shrouded in secrecy. The CSOs that file these communications are not required to divulge those issues to other parties who can then file amicus, for instance. But we now know that just a few weeks ago, the African Commission has adopted new rules of procedure. And now for the first time, the rules of procedure provide for the possibility of different actors with expertise and knowledge on issues to file amicus briefs. So this opens up the possibility, a huge possibility, for CSOs that have communications before these regional bodies to interact and reach out to academics with specific knowledge and expertise in certain areas to file amicus briefs before these bodies. We have seen how it has worked before the African Court, and now we need to deploy it also in respect to the Commission and the Committee. At the African Children's Committee, for instance, we know that the file case to be ever filed against the Children's, before the Children's Committee in 2005 was by Professor Hansungule, Michelo Hansungule at the Center for Human Rights. And that case was really a test case to see whether the committee was ready to receive and determine cases. Of course, there was a disappointment because while the case was filed in 2005, it was finally decided in 2013. But it really triggered the system to start receiving and considering cases. We have seen in the context of the African Court, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria partnering, for instance, with the Coalition of African Lesbians to file a request for an advisory opinion. We have seen the Center for Human Rights also filing a briefing in the SERAP advisory opinion that was filed before the African Court by trying to use, by using their knowledge in international law and international human rights law to interpret specific knotty issues within the African Court Protocol and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Although all these advisory requests have been rejected or declined by the African Court, the jurisprudence that the Center for Human Rights has put on the table of the African Court is worth knowing, and perhaps in future it will be activated. Then finally, I just wanted to speak on two practical areas of collaboration in terms of knowledge sharing. As you know, I'm an adjunct lecturer at the Center for Human Rights. And one of the issues that one of the courses that the Center for Human Rights offers is what is referred to as the advanced human rights courses. These courses are deliberately designed to sit at the nexus between academia and civil society, such that even the speakers, the facilitators, and the lecturers that speak at these courses are not only drawn from the universities, but also from the practitioners' world. And in many cases, the aim of these courses is to ensure that practitioners are also able to ground their knowledge and activism in international human rights law and in theory. And the courses really range from those that focus on the right to development, to women's rights, to sexual minorities. But for the purpose of this presentation, I just want to highlight one course, and that is the course on civil society in Africa that is offered in conjunction with ICNL. And it was supposed, for instance, to be hosted in June, but it has now been transferred to September. And participants here are able, those willing actually can apply to participate in this course. This course really seeks to ground civil society actors within Africa on the regulatory and the operational environment in which they operate. And it is linked and dovetails into the broader discussions about shrinking or shifting civic space in Africa. So, and it brings together a variety of civil society leaders in Africa and beyond, including, for instance, last year, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly. So it's really a space for discussions and thinking about civil society space, laws and regulations that underpin their work on the continent. Then finally, I want just to briefly mention that at Amnesty International, one of the programs that we run is what we refer to as the relief program that we use to provide medical support, legal support, psychosocial support, and even evacuation and living expenses for human rights defenders at risk. This relief program mostly applies to individuals, human rights defenders that we interact with, and it's open to all kinds of human rights defenders, including academics. We have been able, for instance, to support academics from South Sudan who have been at risk in that country, particularly with York University, and Sharia is here also with scholars at risk. But this is a small budget relief program that is usually available for targeted human rights defenders. And we work with partners that work specifically on protection of human rights defenders for long-term support to such human rights defenders. But at the very beginning, when a human rights defender is at risk, we are usually very agile to deploy the support that can be needed at that stage before long-term support is considered and provided. Arnold, I think with those 4 points, I'll stop there and wait for the question or comments at the end. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Japhet. And as usual, very erudite and, ruthlessly efficient delivery of the 4 points that are extremely important for the topic. And yes, I think the question of breaking the silos, and you've been saying this for quite some time. And I'm hoping that civil society, as we listen, at some point we will be able to see that the African human rights system, it's not just Banjo, it's not just Addis, it's not just Midrand. And I think, is it Lesotho that is going to be taking over the role of the committee on the welfare and rights of the child? Yeah. So instead of, it would be important, I think, for, and Arusha as well, it would be important for us as civil society to widen the scope. But again, as you were speaking, I could already see that if there is proper collaboration between universities and civil society, I think the expansion, the conscious expansion of that worldview to then allow for civil society to look at engaging the totality of the African human rights system is part of maybe the responsibility that academics and civil society have towards each other. You also ended by speaking about the role that Amnesty International plays in Africa and across the globe of protecting human rights defenders. And that's extremely important work, which is now in Africa very happily that Defenders, African Defenders, the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, there has been a way in which the African civil society are beginning to take responsibility for expanding the protection of human rights defenders and to complement the valuable work that Amnesty International and other international human rights defender organizations, the International Peace Brigade, Frontline Defenders, FIDH, the World Organization Against Torture, that they do. And so it's very important that that complementarity is being expanded, and the fact that the Pan-Africa Human Rights Defenders, through the initiative, which is supported by the sub-regional networks of the Ubuntu Hub cities, is now bringing even the idea of the Scholars at Risk program into something that we actively think about to hone the skills of human rights defenders, to create opportunities for them to step aside and try to look at the big picture, to also be able to have cultural and diversity exchanges, to deal with the question of rest and respite, because of the fact that many of the human rights defenders, by their nature, they work so much for protection of others and forget about their own welfare, to a point where they almost always run a risk of burnout and a risk that is associated with working without looking after themselves. But more precisely, I think the work that you have explained of the civil society course by the University of Pretoria in collaboration with Irene Petrus, ICNL. I think the biggest danger or vulnerability is that without a proper appreciation of the regulatory environment, if you are effective programming, but you are weak at the level of systems, policies, in terms of compliance with your regulatory environment, that is almost always exploited and taken advantage of by those that get affected negatively by the work of human rights defenders and civil society. So I think that vulnerability is important to cover. So we're going to get into a situation where we look at the questions that are there and get them answered. But at the same time, I'll also maybe ask one question for all the panelists to get into a second round. But I see that there was a question which was asked about Karasira Aimabel, a lecturer from Rwanda, who I understand has been facing pressure as a result of being seen to be critical about the political situation in Rwanda, which shows that, we think universities are centers where there can be academic freedom, but universities are practiced or are institutions that operate in a political context, and the political culture in an environment can be one that either facilitates the exercise of academic freedom, or which also creates hazards. So Shreya, did you want to respond to that one?
Sure, I can speak to that. Thank you, Javier, for bringing that situation to our attention. And like I shared, SAR could explore writing a monitoring report about the incidents that Cara Sierra is facing. If you would like to reach out to us with more information, you can get that contact information on our website. Or, for individuals seeking possible dismissal, looking for ways to continue their academic work in a different setting in case that's not possible in the country in which they currently are in because of the prosecution or persecution that they're facing. Another way to explore what might be possible for Cara Sierra is to encourage him, if you're in touch with him or if you're in touch with someone that knows him, to apply to us for possible assistance so we can review and see what's possible. Because as has been brought up by the other panelists during this time, apart from the body of work that universities can work on to support human rights defenders, there's also a section of it where they can host someone for a little bit so that they can continue their academic work in safety. So that's how I would share that might be next steps that are helpful for Cara Sierra. It also all depends on what level of publicity is another thing to think about when thinking about publishing on someone's behalf about the persecution or prosecution that they're facing, whether that publicity would be helpful to their situation or whether it might perhaps complicate further in a negative way the situation that they're facing. So that's another thing to think about as well. But I've put in the chat, if helpful, either the link to apply directly to us for assistance or with the email that Cara Sierra can reach out to in case the person who brought forth the situation is in touch with him.
Thanks a lot, Shreya. I know that Paul Grady has got questions, but I wonder whether Joseph is able to get a mic or would rather read his question. What do we do, Joseph?
No, I have a mic, but I think
Can
Paul can. Yeah, Paul can pick up and speak about the questions.
Paul, do you mind raising your questions so that there's a proper context?
Sure. Well, hi everyone, and thanks. It's been a really interesting event. I guess my questions are really about academic centers. I've been really struck by the fact that all of the people who have spoken are academics, or at least academics amongst being other things, have been based at centers. And I also work at a center at the University of York in the UK, and we do have a kind of quite particular and peculiar position. So I suppose one thing is, in terms of trying to increase the role of universities in working on issues around civic space and protecting defenders, do we need to be both looking for these centers, but also trying to look to support and create new centers where they don't already exist? And the second question to the speakers is, you've talked about the relationships you have with civil society, and that centers can be a kind of bridge to civil society, which I think is very true. But I also wondered about your relationship to the university, because certainly my experience is they sometimes feel we're a bit odd. We don't do conventional academic work in quite the same way as departments do. And do you have that same experience? Does that ever sort of translate into something that feels more like a threat, not in the same way as a threat to human rights defenders, but that you may be dispensable, for example, if financial cuts are needed or whatever? How do you defend yourself and your role within a university? Because it is a slightly unusual role, I think.
Thanks, Paul. Good question. Can we also get Abdika Hussain to ask a question as well, unless it's fundamentally different from what Paul has asked, because I want the presenters to try and hazard a response to Paul's question.
Oh, thank you very much. I actually very happy to see this kind of discussion. Mine is not actually a question, but actually it's a contribution, which is actually about in some cases that we have in Somalia. As you know, in Somalia, it's actually a pilot state, or actually we have actually a lot of restrictions in terms of freedom, and we actually have a disconnection when it comes for actually academic institutions and the civil society. So we have actually a disconnection for a long time, but so recently we have actually started to have some cooperation in terms of research, data collection, which are actually the basic areas that we are going actually now to cooperate. At the moment, we have started on that basis, Then we're going actually to move forward from that area, And this is very important issue, an issue which is actually now on hot, which is actually much needed in a countries where there's actually now a political turmoil, or where there's actually now a conflict, or recovering from conflicts, where the freedom of expression and the freedom of information are restricted or are limited. So this is a very important issue, and it is much needed. And I will recommend that we will not stop the discussion as well as the recommendations and actually this kind of forums, in here, but actually to continue in order to promote the collaboration between civil society and academic institutions beyond actually in the future, to have it very strong in particular in Africa, in particular where actually there is a political turmoil, or where there actually a conflict, the countries where the freedom of expression or actually the freedoms are restricted. So these are actually the experiences that I'm going to share with you, and to actually to encourage you how this topic is very important here, very, very, very important, and it's heart-touching, So that's my actual experience, and that's my
Thank you, Abdika. Thank you very much indeed. And I suspect we're supposed to finish in a few minutes. Joseph, are we going up to 16:30, which is 17:30 your side? Correct?
Yeah, 17:30. I think 6. It's 2 hours.
Oh, okay, perfect. So let me ask, I think the question that Paul asked, it's a question that we sort of need answers from sort of everyone, because it seems like a cross-cutting question, because we had focused a bit more on the external side, but I think this is the intra-university questions are very important around the level of risk that comes from inside as a result of as Paul says, one of them could be that you are seen as non-academic, not exactly too academic in nature, but the other could be just budgetary issues, to say if there's a question of cutting costs, they'll say, no, let's cut there. The other could also be the question that the question of especially the immigration side of it, to say that when defenders or civil society leaders who may not have enough academic weight are needing to be given a place to study at a university, and the question of whether that would be enough to allow for universities to support visa applications or academic permits. So I think that's a real question. Let's get all the colleagues to respond to that. And Dr. Bijion has given us a link to the civil society course. You can copy and paste it on a separate document, so that you look at whether you want to be involved in that short course at the University of Pretoria. It's on the chat line. But who is going to start? We start with Lisa.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Thanks, Paul. I mean, those are obviously nail on the head type of questions, because I think all university centres have this fairly universal experience of feeling like they're square pegs in round holes. That often the university environment is very different, both politically from the kind of ethos of a university centre, but also importantly that universities are enormous big bureaucracies that are not designed to be quick and responsive and nimble and flexible. And that can often be enormously challenging. I know at CALS, one of the things that's been interesting is that over its 40-year history, CELS has incubated a range of different other organizations who essentially were kind of departments or units or part of CELS who broke away to form independent entities precisely, at least in part, because the bureaucracy was so tough. Trying to run an NGO out of a university was just extremely difficult. And so there's different ways to see that kind of thing. It's obviously has always been kind of disruptive and traumatic at the time for those people involved, but it has given birth to a range of different other organizations. And so I think that it's kind of one way to think about the role of university centers. In terms of, I think you and I have talked about this before, that how important it is for university centers to frame the work that they do. And it's often about translating that work into the kind of academic speak so that it speaks to the kinds of things that matter to universities. So universities are worried often about things like research publications or the attraction of funding. And so sometimes it's about taking the activist work and just repackaging it for the university. It's interesting, this idea of what is academic enough to qualify to kind of attract credibility in the academic context. I mean, that's one of the questions that came up so starkly in the Slapseed case that I was talking about, because the mining company there is arguing that the lawyers and activists who presented in the course aren't entitled to the protection of academic freedom because they weren't producing scholarly work, that they're not scholars. And it really kind of speaks to the ways in which different kinds of knowledge is valued. And I think there's a very clear responsibility on university centers to advocate around expanding what kinds of knowledge we understand to be valuable and who has expertise or not. And then just one last point is that, in terms of kind of supporting university centers, obviously I'm biased having worked so long in one of them, so I think the answer to that is undeniably yes. But one of the key things that I think needs to happen is that university centers themselves need to support each other. That having networks of university centers is enormously valuable given the kind of shared challenges that we face. I know South Africa has a kind of informal network of organizations, of entities like that, which has proved enormously useful to all of us. So just a sort of punt for building of those kinds of networks.
If I may, I'll just share some thoughts as well from our experience in working with university centers in case that's helpful. Lisa, I think what you're sharing is extremely helpful, and I think it's great to have the perspective given that you're at a center. And I agree with you that I think sometimes the struggle is trying to showcase how it is academically relevant, though that connection seems quite obvious to us. And I will just say that, to Paul's point, I do think that more support for them would be helpful within the university setting, but I will also say that with SAR's work, we've seen university centers be able to move the work forward because they are so dedicated, and sometimes because the university is so bureaucratic, having sort of decision making to, for example, host a scholar or practitioner happen in a smaller group is easier. So we have seen quite strong university centers within our network that so to join the network, you still need higher up institutional buy-in. But once you join the network and you start moving forward the activities, we have seen centers take that on and be able to push it forward because they're already used to setting up positions or engagements with those individuals that may not be seen traditionally as academics, even though we know that there's a lot that they can provide to the university space. I think another way that might be helpful to boost the work that centers are doing is to show the value that those centers have for student learning and engagement. And especially because I think topics of human rights and human rights defending are of relevance to this younger generation that are coming to universities. They're active, especially there's a lot of student movements in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in South Africa, which my fellow panelists can probably speak better to words, but I think that's another way to try and approach that, to try and show the inherent worth of the center. In terms of tensions between the center and the administration, I can't speak fully to that. We only see what our primary representatives that we're in touch with through SAR do on their end, and I can say that they really do move the work forward, but I imagine there's just bureaucratic hurdles that they run up against as well. But that all being said, I think developing such centers is helpful. And I also want to share that just in our past experience, those centers have pushed forward this work quite a bit, given that they're so dedicated to the issues of academic freedom and human rights. And I do think that they are valuable to student experience, and sharing, like sort of reframing the academic contributions that they make, like I said, also showcasing how it's important for students to learn about these topics and how students are so interested in them. So I will share that that's our experience from SAR side.
Zahara, would you want, you were speaking? Dr.
Japhet,
okay. Japhet, Zahara, and then we go to the next question. I see Dr. Livingston's hand is up.
Okay, no, I just wanted to mention, I think the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria has a very unique dual personality. So it is a fully fledged academic department within the Faculty of Law, but it's also registered as an NGO, as a separate entity within South African law as an NGO. That to some extent gives it the leeway to operate as an NGO, but it may also open it, of course, to other conditionalities that might be imposed to NGOs and civil society generally, depending on the laws. But so far, the South African law has been pretty good for civil society activities. And I think as Paul Grady asked, should we advocate for more of these centers? I think so, but from my own anecdotal assumptions, I see that most of the centers that have thrived and really made an impact in human rights are those that really have a very strong practical component to their works, as evidenced by even the of the centers that are present here. In Kenya, for instance, there are 2 universities that have centers of human rights, but they are little known in the country or even within the universities themselves, because compared to those present here that merge practice with activism. I think perhaps that could be one of the factors that really define how a center evolves and makes impact in human rights movements. Thanks, Arnold.
Dr. Zahara?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. With regard to whether centers are regarded as distant cousins or, relatives of the mainstream institutions. I think our model is just like the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria. We are an administrative unit of the School of Law. So in actual terms, we are a department, an organizing unit in terms of staffing and all other arrangements. And as such, we are entitled to certain support from the university, including premises, staff, and other logistics. And I think that helps a lot because we are able to share in what the university guarantees to other units. But of course, we have our own semi-autonomous model. We can do our own fundraising. We can enter into our own collaboration. So it's a good dual, effect. But at the same time, of course, we are still subject to some of the formalities and the red tape of the university. I can say, for example, that during the initial COVID lockdown, when the university locked down almost completely, we had challenges just even processing funds, to do some of the COVID-related work. So that is one of the inhibitions of being part of the setup. We have to be accountable in terms of the university procurement, the accounting systems. We also have to apply for research permits. And right now in Uganda, the research requests go through a National Council for Science and Technology, but pass through a desk on the President's office. So we are also caught up in those kind of formalities. But it helps that we are wrapped up in the university system, and we are also accountable to the School of Law Board. So when things get a bit uncomfortable, we are quick and to sort of refer back to our mother institution. In terms of the tensions, yes, I think the tensions are there with the university. Sometimes they're there when you undertake an activity and the university just feels that maybe it was a bit out of the way of what it should have been. But also the finances. Sometimes we have a discomfort with the finances, the fact that we generate finances and we have to keep explaining that they're for a particular reason and we can't put them within the university pool. So that sometimes creates tensions with the management. In terms of some potential collaboration, our public interest law clinic at the School of Law has started an initiative, has created an East African network of public interest litigation clinics. So I think that sort of helps to learn lessons, to share within each other. And I think that is something that perhaps as the African Defenders we can take forward. How can we cross-pollinate and strengthen each other as centers and other university settings and other university institutions are doing human rights work. Thank you, Arnold.
Sorry, I was saying, let me move over to Dr. Livingstone Sawanyana to make his remarks. Joseph, may you unmute Dr. Livingstone Sawanyana?
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, Arnold.
Hi, how are you, man?
Fine, how are you? You see me as well?
I can see you.
Yeah,
Well
great
done.
to see you. Just to say that I really enjoyed the discussion, and I want to thank African Defenders for such an important initiative. Of course, your very eminent speakers have shed substantive light on this subject. And it's an area of great interest. As far back as the 1990s, Professor Makao Mutua, whom we all know very well, in his book on NGOs in East Africa, made a very passionate plea for collaboration between civil society and the academia. Indeed, I think it's important for us to enhance these synergies for our mutual benefit. Much as, of course, we may be seen to occupy different spaces, my view is that we actually occupy the same space and we suffer the same threats. Both the academia and civil society suffer the same threats. Actually, listening to Zahara Nampeo, it is very clear that we are all in this together. Just 2 or 3 areas where I think it's important for us to put emphasis. One, of course, as an independent expert on promotion of the democratic and equitable international order, I always hope that the academia could help me in conducting research and generating data and information necessary to, of course, inform the world out there. And I don't see much of that synergy. I don't see much of that collaboration. And many times as independent experts, we suffer a lot in trying to put together arguments which are persuasive. And I believe universities are well placed to help us in conducting this research. And of course, thrashing out some of these very difficult issues. For example, right now, I'm grappling with the question of the impact of economic and financial policies of multilateral financial institutions on governance. And sometimes you feel like you need some support. So I believe knowledge development would be a very important area in which both of us could actually benefit. But also, there's another area where I think there hasn't been a lot of interest by the academia, despite the fact that some great interest to us in civil society, and perhaps synergy there would be helpful. That is in understanding this whole notion of NGO sustainability. There's so much talk about sustainability, but there's very little that has been done to enhance this subject. And I believe the academia would be very helpful in doing this. Of course, Zahara has outlined areas where we could mutually benefit from each other's intervention. But all in all, I think we need to ensure that there is this positive approach to this issue, because the academia sometimes also works in isolation. Sometimes, of course, they have their own pressures. Civil society also, we have our own pressures, and we may not actually find room to interface that easily. Now, of course, one other aspect, and I think this needs to be emphasized, is the whole question of translating knowledge and rhetoric into practice. There is so much in terms of knowledge that is developed, research that's done by universities, which needs to be translated into the public realm. And I don't see much of that. A lot of studies are done, a lot of research is done. It is piling dust out there. And from a practitioner's point of view, it would be useful for us to translate that information for the benefit of the ordinary person. And there is need there for synergy. But also, sometimes we think on very serious notes, but even paying courtesy calls. Arnold, we need courtesy calls to be paid. Eh? This collaboration begins with sharing ideas and trying to have this speaking of our minds. So you rarely see the academia visiting civil society. I have made efforts sometimes to invite professors to come over and share their ideas, their concerns. They need to move from the towers. That's not where they belong. They belong to the public who pay them. Of course, speaking from the global south, we have our own problems. In the global north, there's a lot of synergy, there are a lot of linkages between civil society and of course the academia. But here in the global south, there are different entities altogether. The talk would be there, but they work differently. They don't share these resources, they don't share this knowledge. But there have been efforts, and I want to commend the Human Rights and Peace Center at Makerere. There have been efforts. Actually, Makerere University School of Law has taken very positive initiatives. For example, we have very strong and ongoing collaboration with PILAC, the Public Interest Law Clinic at Makerere University, where students are on a regular basis seconded to come over and learn from us, but also, make contributions to the work that we do, which is a very practical approach. Of course, Zahara has talked about amicus curiae. We have made that effort before. We need more of that. We need more effort in joint strategies towards legislative advocacy. So all in all, this is an interesting area, and I have really enjoyed hearing from Lisa, Zahara, Japhet, Shreya. Thank you so much. I think it's very helpful. Arnold, here, much as there was an ease of the lockdown, we still have curfew. So I will be running very fast because we have traffic jams. For example, for example, speaking about traffic jams, I need an answer from the academia. How best can we deal with traffic jams in Kampala? I know you have been to Kampala. It's terrible. It's terrible. You take hours and hours. These are areas where mutual knowledge sharing and, of course, collaboration would be very helpful. Let's not think about those very high sounding areas. Let's look at the ordinary person. How do we generate knowledge and information to help this ordinary person to ease his life or her life? This is where this collaboration is much needed. Yes, we could talk about all these powerful researches that we can do, but what is more important is solving the common man's problem, the whole question of livelihood, the whole question of health, shelter, all these sort of problems that constantly are making life very miserable for our people. These are the areas where we need joint collaboration. Yes, we can research on so many things, but this ordinary woman or man or orphan or whatever needs help, and we need solutions. The state needs answers to some of the problems. So Arnold, I need to run to beat the traffic, but I must congratulate the panelists and African Defenders for this initiative. It was, of course, very opportune for me to see you, Arnold. It's been long. Where have you been? Okay, bye for now.
Thank you, Dr. Soren. Thank you very much indeed. So we are left with about 10 minutes, colleagues. I see that our chief, Hassan, is entered the room. I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak at the end. I also see my sister Pamela, my sister Memory Bandera. She's also coming. She helps a lot in organizing us and ensuring that our programming doesn't rail off to achieve unintended outcomes. So good to see you, colleagues. So what I wanted to do is just to ask one question and give the presenters what I would call maybe an opportunity for something that sounds like a Twitter, if you're writing a tweet, but that's the response that you want. So it's a tweet verbal, a verbal tweet in response. It arose from Zahara's presentation. She spoke about COVID, and I didn't hear much around the impact of COVID on civil society, university partnerships. I know that, for example, the Ubuntu Hub City's capacity to relocate defenders from one country to another has been negatively impacted by COVID, even though the protection mechanisms have remained, at full throttle in terms of ensuring that within the means, all those human rights defenders who need protection because of the impact of their work on those people who may then pose a danger. I think generally, by and large, we have been able to maintain critical protection support at the level of the Pan-African Human Rights Defenders and its collaborating networks. But then I just wanted colleagues from the academics to speak a bit on how COVID-19 is impacting on all the things that we're speaking about, but also on the potentiality for future university civil society work. Unfortunately, it will have to be a Twitter response person to come to maybe 2 minutes before 5 when we close, in which time I'll then give Hassan the 2 minutes to close. Who is going to start? Lisa?
Sure. Thanks, Arnold. I want to answer your question about the COVID impact and tie it back to something that Dr. Sewanyama raised, which was the issue of sustainability. We all know that activist work is incredibly difficult and takes its toll, and as you mentioned earlier, leads to high levels of burnout. And all of that is being exacerbated by COVID. I think the stress that people are under and the scarcity of the resources that they have to do their work is already compounding that. And so there's just 2 points to make there. The first is that one of the key components of an approach which facilitates sustainability is self-care. But self-care is often an uncomfortable topic. People squirm at the idea because self-care is seen as something that's kind of soft somehow, that doesn't fit within the ethos of a kind of hardcore activist. There can also be high levels of guilt associated with self-care because it's kind of seen as a luxury. And I think all of those challenges are really kind of in stark relief because of COVID. One of the ways in which this relationship between academia and civil society can assist with mitigating those challenges is that if academics are actively researching and writing about issues such as self-care, publishing articles in academic journals, somehow gives the idea a sort of credibility and a weight which it didn't have before. It shouldn't have to come to that, but the reality is that kind of thing can help. So I really want to encourage colleagues to be focusing their research on issues of self-care and sustainability. And just to end, I think now more than ever we need each other. Everyone is trying to do more with less in the current climate, and so it just makes collaboration like that we've been talking about today even more important.
Thank you. Shall we hear from Zahara?
Yes, thank you, Arnold. In Uganda, the COVID pandemic has been referred to as a war, and we hear the leaders saying that this is a war that we have to fight, and we have to fight using all means without, necessarily what we have been used to. And I think because of this complexity, it has allowed a justifiable reason for the state to keep taking space and doing things that ordinarily wouldn't pass in terms of human rights standards. And I think as individuals, as human rights defenders, we have also unknowingly given up some rights in the context of managing the pandemic. In the process, some of the state institutions are being disabled. Day by day, individuals are losing rights unknowingly, slowly by slowly. And I think in terms of what we need to do, I think as human rights defenders, we need to be documenting, carefully analyzing and reflecting on some of the effects of this during this time and reclaiming our space. So for example, during the lockdown, at a certain point, lawyers were not allowed to go to court, and then the president allowed 30 lawyers in the whole of Uganda to represent cases. So, of course, what happens to access to justice? So I think going forward, we need to be carefully reflective of the implications of this pandemic and what it means, in terms of protecting space, protecting rights, and advocacy for better.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And Shreya?
I would like to thank African Defenders again for holding this, and all my fellow panelists for their contribution, as well as the attendees. And thank you, Arnold, for managing the conversation. I would just like to share that while I understand obviously that coronavirus has complicated some of our work and the work that we're all hoping to improve due to funding constraints or travel restrictions, I do think it presents an opportunity to seek other ways to encourage solidarity between universities and civil societies, whether that's through bringing people together closer, at least through virtual events that wouldn't have been able to take place in person, or also looking to see how we can support human rights defenders and civil society organizers through remotely connecting with them online. I would just like to share that I think obviously these issues of strengthening the civil society are inherent to university spaces, and there's a lot of collaboration that could be undertaken. I think that this is moved forward by solidarity and working together, and that's why we encourage people to join the SAR network, to work together to try and find solutions. So I invite everyone at a university to join the network and see if that might be a possibility for them at their institution to further this work. But also to find different ways to engage human rights defenders on university campuses. Like I shared earlier, temporary positions don't necessarily only have to be teaching positions. They can be research-related positions. They can be positions to improve and build on the skills that the human rights defender has to take back to their civil society, but also in a way for them to share their experience with the university and also encourage students to be involved in this work, because I do get the sense that students are quite interested in human rights work, especially now. So I think while COVID has presented a lot of problems, I do also think that it's presented, you know, a lot of ways that humans are able to problem solve creatively, which I think is the way to move forward to try and strengthen CSOs in collaboration with universities. So I look forward to the further discussions we have around this.
Thank you. So, Japhet, your parting shots.
Thank you, Arnold. I think just as Shreya has said, COVID-19 really has brought massive challenges, but also some opportunities. And just for instance, to reference the Center for Human Rights advanced course on civil society law in Africa, previously, like the one that was held in September of last year, it would bring about 20 to 30 civil society actors from across the continent into Pretoria to conduct the study, and then a host of facilitators and speakers. But now that it is virtual, it will possibly allow for more participation from many other people, from speakers and facilitators who, for one reason or another, will not have been able to travel. But the possibility of holding it remotely or virtually opens it up for more participation. And I think also just to say, in terms of a final point on the human rights centers, my sense is that most of them are established within faculties of law, as we see even in this present discussion. And this always brings the question that human rights spaces are dominated by lawyers, by legal professionals. And sometimes we as lawyers might be blinded to the fact that human rights as a concept and as a practice is a multidisciplinary enterprise. And more we need to bring other actors into the space to also enrich our understanding and our approaches. So I think also the opportunity that for easy organizing of events where other actors can be brought into play is presented with this virtual world that we have entered into. For instance, we quickly, in relation to the rules of procedure of the African Commission, 4 NGOs, Amnesty International, Center for Human Rights, ISLA, the Institute for Strategic Litigation in Africa, and HRDA are convening in the course of this week a discussion on the rules of procedure of the African Commission. Before the world of COVID-19, it would have taken us months to organize and bring people together. But in this context, it's easy to bring civil society within a very short period of time to sit down and reflect on issues that affect human rights space on the continent. Thank you, Arnold. That's my final. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Very, very useful information, and including the question of over-legalization and over-representation of the legal profession in human rights work, which in itself has also created sometimes a delinkage between human rights work, human rights practitioners, and ordinary people for whom we speak about human rights. And then I have a feeling that we scratched the surface. This was an introductory conversation. I think we need to have a second round and to also expand on other initiatives where civil society have generally benefited from being given an opportunity to reflect away from their work. I know that we have some government-sponsored initiatives. Irene Petras, who is here, we worked together before, and she went for a year or two on a chevening scholarship that was linked to the risk she was facing, but which also allowed her to go and study and get a master's program at the London School of Economics. And myself, I got what is referred to as a Fulbright scholarship, which also was linked to an assessment of threat factors. So these government-sponsored initiatives also play a similar role of linking universities with human rights defenders and civil society leaders. And so this is why I think it has been a wonderful opportunity, Joseph and Christine, for the organization. And so let me give Hassan an opportunity to say a few remarks and to close the session. Hassan?
Thank you, Chief Anna, and good to see you. I know that Joseph and you have humbly represented the Pan-African defenders and highlighted the origin and where we came from with this concept of linking universities, civil society, and human rights defenders in exile. So I won't go to that site, and I really want to say also thank you to Dr. Zahra Namboyo and Lisa Chamberlain and Jabat Egon and Sharif Belhari for taking their valuable time to take part of this important dialogue, which has just started. I've gone through your charts and I've seen it, you know, we are just warming up. As now Arnold is warming up for his next assignment. We will never allow him to retire or say that I retired or I've gone somewhere else. I see there will be a course of, you know, what do you call it, some sort of fertilization have already taken place and ideas have been put forward. We'll be happy to be part of this process and remain seized of this matter. Indeed, COVID-19 have really hampered the growth of these collaborations because of restrictions on movement of human rights defenders to go to Ubuntu hub cities or other universities in order to engage better protection and also to continue their studies or what they were doing. But still we have some people who are already places there and who still continue. We have been able to renew their stay there and so that they can continue their work despite finishing their terms of scholarship and protection, but still we were able, because of COVID-19, to continuously support them until this, what do we call it, invisible enemy is being defeated globally, or at least, you know, known and contained. DD and AD origin, African defenders and defenders, we originate ourselves from university. Came from the York University, collaboration of Amnesty International and York University have produced actually this initiative in the initial phase and supported in Canada. And it still supports, York University Canada still supports these processes and gives any kind of logistics we need to the platform of its research wing at the Vice President's office. So we know when you are in exile, when you are challenged, when you don't have a home, when you are being sheltered in university and given a platform where you can collaborate, research, work with other academia, and cool down yourself and come up with outcomes. What it become, like now the program we are running here in the continent, together with my colleagues who are part of this panel. Ubuntu hub cities, if I conclude my remark on this, the linkage of that, it was there's a coffee break at the Serpentine Par in Geneva, where some African diplomats, senior African diplomats, and Arnold Tisunga and myself were able to brainstorm the concept of sheltering human rights defenders on the continent. And to disabuse the notion that you can only be safe and continue to study in third other country, like in Europe, America, or elsewhere other than Africa. So we say that we have to disabuse this and find out hub cities within the continent where African human rights defenders feel welcome, institutions adopted them, cities adopted them, and still, can continue in a position of safety without dislocation of culturally, without dislocation of environmentally, and still be part of the pulse. And then even if things prolong in their home countries, can become part of that society and work from there. And now it's working, but this COVID, which is temporary, I hope, intervened, but we'll still continue on that. So in that context, we're very much interested in further developing collaborations between universities, human rights defenders, and other civil society, and largely academia. I share with Dr. Livstam's remark whereby we really want the academia to further engage on research even with the gaps, to follow the footsteps of University of York, actually undertaking very, very critical research with regard to psychology, well-being of the human rights defenders, protection gaps globally. So we must have our counterpart at the continent also availing their brilliant students to come forward and take initiatives in working with us in order to further protection mechanisms in the continent. I thank you so much, Chief. I've been away from this meeting because of the Prime Minister of Sudan, which was a very, very important briefing international partners, and I was lucky to be invited on that. But otherwise, I will get the notes and the briefings, and I thank you so much. Namaste.
So we are done. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you to the resource persons. Thank you, Joseph and Christina. We can close the meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.